a number of people would later on feel that Marcus Garvey needed to go beyond just Pan-Africanism, but needed to go beyond a broader nationalism, which would bring in and form alliances with working class people throughout the world, regardless of their race, in order to promote the ideas of liberation.
Mhm. All right. Now, I am sort of curious. Okay, when we say Pan-Africanism, and of course, everything is usually attached to ideology. Um, Now, what was the concrete agenda to put it into practice? Because a lot of people do not understand ideology. They understand it when it is brought to their level. Of course, Marcus Garvey is a very high class individual. The academia, when they discuss Pan Africanism, they usually use terms of the academia, terminologies, and languages that they can understand perfectly, and that I understand. But to the average people, to the ordinary people, how was the idea of Pan Africanism expected to be translated for them so that they too can understand it instead of maybe remaining within the intellectual cycle?
The ideas of Pan-Africanism had to be translated into concrete benefits on the ground for these people in terms, for example, of the social conditions in which they lived, in terms of their wages, in terms of their opportunities for education. We will remember that these people were deprived. These people, and that was accentuated in conditions of the Depression and the First World War. So these people saw this Pan-Africanism not in a very ideological sense, as you say. They understood that there were ideas, but they had to see it transformed in their very lives, in their various communities in the Caribbean, in the United States, and in the diaspora generally. So this is how these people, the broad mass of the people would have seen it. And this is what the broad mass of the people expected. I think we should note here too that by the 1930s, especially in the Caribbean, or before I go to that, I would say that in this period that we're talking about, the late 20s, going into the 1930s, in this period we were talking about, there was also another stream of Pan-Africanism or Black nationalism that was emerging in the ideas of negritude, as they would say in French, negritude. It came out of people like Aimé Césaire. Now, Aimé Césaire, put it like this: Aimé Césaire was our neighbor. Martinique is just north of St. Lucia. This is where Aimé Césaire was born. St. Lucia shares with Martinique should we call it the infamy of being colonized by the French. So we were colonized by both the French and the British. Because of that, we speak a French-based Creole. And so you find that the ideas of negritude were also ideas that were taking root. You had people like Leopold Senghor and in Africa, and he and Aimé Césaire made that link, and they also made link with intellectuals in the United States. But at that level, it was still very, very ideological and intellectual. And so perhaps quite a number of our people in the Caribbean, and I'm speaking not just of the British Caribbean, but I'm speaking also of other parts of the Caribbean, like like that part of the Caribbean colonized by the French, only begun to understand when it was brought, or begun to understand it more clearly when it resonated with their actual lives and with their actual involvement, to get freedoms, political freedoms as well. Because here, I want to point out that up to then in the Caribbean, we had a system of what we call crown colony government. And in that crown colony government, the broad mass of the people, especially the Black people, the broad mass did not have political power. You had a certain amount of political authority in the hands of the planter merchant class, who were predominantly what they call colored, of mixed race, and also they were also white. But for participation in that government, the franchise was based on property. The majority of Black people did not have the property qualifications. Of course, in places like Jamaica and even in St. Lucia, you would find that even in the days of slavery, Black people had run away and that they had cultivated land in the hills. But this land was not, this property was not recognized by the colonial government sitting in either England or France. And so they did not have these qualifications, the qualifications that would allow them to participate. It was only with the explosion, the rebellion of the 1930s, that you find that people would eventually, the broad mass of the people would in the Caribbean, that is, would eventually be brought into the wider struggle for national liberation, which was also unfolding in Africa and in the United States as well, but which was stymied quite a bit in the United States. It was only then that you find that our Black people were coming into their own. However, it was also at that time that Marcus Garvey's organizations began to wane. So that at that time you find that as an organized force, he did not have, he started his influence as an organized force started to diminish. But at the very same time, the seeds and the ideas that he sowed started to germinate in the liberation movements, in the labor movements throughout the Caribbean.
Thank you so much for that. Now, the idea that Marcus Garvey was propagating, and the idea that was coming from negritude, coming from the branch of French Africans now, what was the major difference? And was there at a point the desire or the intention to merge the two together for a common purpose?
Yes, there was that intention to mesh together, because Garvey and even people like Senghor and Aimé Césaire saw the streams merging, because whereas in the very early emergence of negritude, it was a very intellectual movement. People, especially like Césaire, saw the need for it to make connection with the broad mass of the working people. And that is why we found, for example, Césaire going back to his native Martinique and becoming immersed and involved in the political movement in Martinique. And it was in this period, just before before he went back to Martinique, that we would find that he would develop a lot of the ideas which would eventually lead to his immersion in the politics of Martinique, and the Caribbean. And I'm sure you must have heard, or perhaps you have read his seminal poem, because he was a great poet as well. His seminal poem, "The Cahier," in which he described. Well, he was talking about a return to his native land and his engagement in his native land at that political anti-colonial level.
That's interesting. So at least at the point there was this desire to merge the two together and to have a common purpose, and that should be natural, because if they are both fighting for the interests of the African people or the people of African descent, and that interest must sort of become the same for both now. Otherwise, we'll go to look for another way to interpret it.